Welcome viewers to another fully loaded and action-packed episode with a distinctively Welsh narrow gauge flavour. This time, Andy McVitie and I team up and travel to the Ffestiniog Railway to oversee some of its winter projects. We invited Andrew Charman, editor of sister title Narrow Gauge World, along too. But before we get to see all of that, let's take a look at our layout of the month, Clydach.
I've been to many exhibitions over the years and stood at layouts and watched nothing happening for 10 minutes or so, and I thought, I can do better than that. So I designed this to see something moving all the time. That was the thinking behind it. I'm Richard Holder, and this is my layout. It's the Clydach Railway. It's fictitious, but it's based on a number of different places. Inspiration to me, so the bridge is based on the one at the Camel Estuary in Cornwall. The station over the back there is based on Tannibulk on the Ffestiniog, and so there are various places that inspire me, and I've included them in the layout. I really wanted to include water and the estuary and the beach and so on, and I'd seen quite a few people using the latest development from various companies, and I haven't been that impressed with them. So I read it a little bit out, and this is based just on using the stuff used to put on the ceilings, Artex, and then paint and loads of high gloss varnish, and most people seem to think it's fairly convincing. I just bought a tub of Artex. It was supposedly for repair from B&Q, spread it out over the layout, stippled it with a 1-inch paintbrush to get the sort of ripple effect. Same with the waves, formed them just using a brush, and then when that was thoroughly dry, paint it with acrylic paints, so a lighter shade towards the edge, deeper in the middle, and again when that's thoroughly dry, about 7 coats of really high gloss exterior varnish on the top. I think they do like the little bits of details. What I like putting in, and there are lots of little detailed scenes around that people can find. There's a whole range of different locomotives. Some are just basically white metal kits which are on N-gauge chassis and then painted up, usually with sort of spray cans from Holford's and then detailed afterwards. There's one ready to run, which is the little green diesel, which was actually an Austrian diesel, which I've just repainted to look a bit more anglicised. But other than that, it's mainly kits of some sort. Please don't talk about me when I'm gone. Oh honey, though our friendship ceases from now on. It took about 18 months, but that was virtually full-time. I had retired, my wife is younger than me, she was still working, so when she went off to work, I worked on the layout virtually full-time 5 days a week until she came home, and providing there was a meal on the table, that was absolutely fine. I used to model years and years ago in 00, and I was never really happy to try and fit a convincing layout in a reasonable space. You get unrealistic curves, and as soon as I saw narrow gauge in 009, I thought, yes, you can get away with tight curves, steep gradients, and it looks okay. It was when I retired in 2003 really that I got into 009 modelling, and I wouldn't do anything else. I'm just so pleased that the public seem to like it, and that's really encouraging for us as operators.
The winter period is a busy one for all heritage railways, but for the Festiniog it offered us a chance to see progress on the track renewals at Moyling Tunnel. Our point of departure was Tanagrisha Halt, and traction for the day provided courtesy of a small Bagley Drury 060 locomotive with more than enough power for our short works train. So the weather is finally, looks like it's easing a little bit here, and I'm at the entrance to Moyling Tunnel with Nick Griffiths, who's safety manager of the railway, and you're one of 80 paid staff here at the railway and make sure everything's running full time. But I can see we've got a little bit of work going on here.
We have. This is a fairly major project to relay about 400 metres of track through the Moyling Tunnel, which was constructed in the late 1970s. As part of the deviation. The original route of the railway was flooded by a dam for the hydroelectric power station in the 1950s, and the company was able, after a protracted struggle, to reopen the line as far as Blaenau-Festiniog in 1982. The tunnel was opened in the late 1980, 81, I think, off the top of my head, and the track dates from then, and the sleepers are life expired, and the rails have been replaced once in the lifespan of the tunnel, but the water is very, very acidic and has attacked the feet and the webs and the rail heads of the rails to the point where they are now life expired.
Is this something you find across the line, or is it just because of that particular area?
It's the environment within the tunnel, it's the acidic water within the tunnel that accelerates the corrosion process. The sleepers are the original ones laid in the late 70s when the tunnel was constructed. The rails were replaced in 2001, I think it is. So they've done about 15, 16 years, and with it being replaced with brand new rail to a slightly different section. So this is here is a junction between the older rail and sleepers.
Rail of old and the new
joint
rail.
There, the fish plate joint is the new sleepers, which are plastic, it's recycled plastic.
This is pretty cutting edge, isn't it, the recycled plastic sleeper type thing? It's not something that's been done for many decades in this country, is it?
No, it is a fairly new technology. Apparently it's from the States, where it has been used successfully for a number of years. Network Rail, I believe, are also using this type of sleepers. We've had them down for about 5 or 6 years in various places to evaluate them, to the point where we've done some fairly lengthy relays in the last couple of years, probably about 1 kilometre in total, using these sleepers in various places. So
shall we have a look in the tunnel and see what other work's going on? Lead the way. So we're now at the other end of the tunnel, where we can see the excavation work going on. So I'm guessing this is the original track bed then?
Yeah, this is laid when the tunnel was excavated and the track was laid in the late 70s. The ballast is made of the arisings from the rock, and it's of indifferent quality and irregular size. So the excavator is digging out the old ballast base once the sleepers and rails have been removed, loading it into the dumper truck, which is tracked, and the dumper truck will run onto these wagons, which have ramps at one end, and it's progressively filling the wagons until they're full, and then once all the wagons are full, we'll take them out and replace them with wagons loaded with fresh ballast. And it's a reverse operation where the excavator will load the clean ballast into the dumper, which then runs out and tips it at the far end to the work site, and progressively work back towards the wagons, and when they're emptied, they'll load them with the spoil and then swap them around with full ones.
You can see just how much water's coming out of the excavations, because these wagons are literally dripping water.
Yes, they are.
Crazy. So until March next year, roughly, or March this year even?
The deadline with the train service starts at the end of March this year.
Okay.
So we've got about 10 weeks effectively to complete the project. We have had a few hitches to do with locomotive failures and so on, but that's been resolved and we're back on track to complete it.
Good stuff. Excellent bit of work. We left the track gang to continue their hard work and made our way down to the carriage restoration workshops to admire some excellent craftsmanship.
I'm Andy, the editor of British Railway Modelling magazine, and I'm here with Glenn Williams, who's the Chief Carriage Works Supervisor, and he's been working on this beautiful Pullman coach here. Glenn, one of the first questions I got to ask you is about the precise lining you've been doing here, how it's achieved, how you do it without making a horrible mess.
It's a very old technique. It's just basically two chalk lines, and you fill in with a long bristled brush between the two chalk lines.
Are you able to give us a bit of a demonstration of what you're talking about?
No problem, no problem. So you get the chalk, the string line, run the chalk down it, like so. Obviously, normally you do longer lengths.
Yeah.
So, hold it to show that. There you have. That's how you would line the whole vehicle out. So you'd mark the whole vehicle like that, and then fill in with the paintbrush.
But once you've established these straight lines and you put the paint on, how do you then stop it from running and dripping and
experience? Yeah, you have to get the consistency of the paint correct.
On the question of experience, then, actually, I mean, what sort of experience do you need before you can start tackling something like this, which is of so high value? When do they let you loosen it, in other words?
Difficult one. I've been doing it for about 20 years now. So,
right.
And I learned from a very old gentleman who'd been doing it since the day dot. I mean, he apprenticed in sign writing and painting carriages.
Right.
And I was only allowed to do basic things with him.
Right.
And as I progressed and he got more confident in what I could do, he allowed me to do a lot more with this. Okay.
So this is quite a piece of work, the whole carriage, as you explained, but from start to finish, are you kind of midway through it right now or approaching the end?
It's getting close to the end, this one. We've got the carpet to install inside, the upholstery to finish.
Right.
But obviously the external stuff is largely there now, finished.
So how long did it take you from start to finish, do you think?
This one, it's about 9 months. This is a first class carriage though, so you've got all this extra fancy stuff on it, and the paint finish is far higher quality. Our third class carriages are more like 6 months build time.
There's also several layers of paint on here. You've got such a tremendous sense of gloss. Can you just describe to us how many, what's entailed in the painting of this?
Well, you start off with the primer coat, which obviously helps fill the pores of the wood a bit.
Yeah.
And then there's two undercoats to build up a solid base colour. On this one, there's 3 gloss coats, or finish coats as we call them.
Yeah.
And then it gets a very heavy rub down with a 320 grit rubbing pad. And then it gets 2 more top coats before the sign writing goes on and the transfers.
There's so many layers of paint because of the Welsh weather, or is that just...
No, it's just that is the nature of this vehicle. Because it's first class, you go for that little bit extra. The third class carriages only go as far as the 2 or 3 finish coats initially, and then they don't get the rub down.
Okay, so talking about fancy details then, do you want to take us inside and show us some of the stuff there?
Go inside, have a look at some of the stuff inside.
Great. So here we are inside the carriage, and even in this state you can see that it's absolutely luxurious. Glenn, can you sort of talk about some of the details we've got going on in here?
The concept of the carriage came about because they wanted flowing lines, curves and things, hence all the shaping of the various things. I mean, the seats, they've got curved shapes which correspond with the lamppost.
Right.
They also wanted inlays marquetry that followed the lines of the carriage as well. Hence why they're also incorporated into it.
And the design of this coach, if I'm correct, it's not based on an actual model, it's inspired by previous models, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Our third class carriages are very much of this style of construction, but the interior is a lot more basic, tongue and groove ceiling, whereas this has got proper faced plywood, and makes it feel that more classy.
So at what stage will we actually start fitting out the carriage then?
Very soon, actually. As soon as the carpet goes down, we will then start putting the seats in, the tables can go in properly. final finishing like cleaning the windows, detail.
That's been really brilliant, Glenn. Thank you very much for that. So if people are interested in seeing this and riding on this fantastic carriage, when can they expect to do so?
Hopefully around the end of April, early May, on the Festiniog Railway here in North Wales.
Well, after you've seen that brilliant guided tour of the workshops here with the lining out of the carriages, of course it's really beautiful to see that on our models as well, but let's face it, we're not all brilliant at doing lining on models, and there is an easier way, and that's to use transfers or decals. Now, for this little project here in the studio workshops that we've got temporarily today, I thought we'd do something on this van. Now, I tend to do a lot of railway models, but of course vehicles on our models are important too. This one here comes courtesy of Oxford Diecast, but it's been modified by modelrailwayscenery.com. There's a little switch there to the underside, and it's been fitted with some lights. So just switching that on, you can see we've got headlights, tail lights, and some flashing indicators. And I thought today we could test out some transfers courtesy of GM Model Supplies, a manufacturer who makes these little packs of decals that you can apply to vehicles on your layout to transform them into railway orientated vehicles. So here we've got a choice of Network Rail or EWS. So let's apply some of these transfers onto the van, test them out, see how they perform, and of course, well, see what the finished product looks like. Let's get started. So starting out with the decals, it's as easy as cutting them out with a pair of scissors. Now these are water slide decals, which is what the majority of decals are nowadays. Double check though, because there are still some meth fix which use methylated spirits to apply to your models, and some of them are actually flipped as well, so you need to apply them the other way around and then remove the backing. But these are just fairly conventional, so you can see there we've got a carrier film on the backing paper, and it's just released by dunking it in water. So I'll just put that face down into the water and just let it absorb for a few seconds. And would you believe it, I've forgotten the tweezers at home, so I found these around the workshop. Let's just go fishing for this transfer out of the bottom here, being very careful not to damage it at all. Okay, now we want to get rid of the majority of the water that's on that transfer. Carefully tipping the van onto its side, and this should easily slide off now, as you can see. Now it's important when you get this stage of the transfer where you're just sliding it off, don't slide too much of it off without actually applying it to your vehicle, or else you'll end up with it curving underneath or folding back on itself. So get a little bit of paper towel at the ready. Make sure that the surface of your van is completely clean, and don't forget that many people have problems applying transfers where they get a ghosting effect or a sort of a white sheen on the transfer, and that's because they're not applying it to a gloss surface. Transfers always perform better if you're applying them to a smooth gloss surface rather than a dull, matte, slightly pitted surface. So just carefully applying this onto the side of the van. Like so. And there is a little bit of movement with transfers, so once you've got it on, don't dab it down straight away. You can always adjust it. You can see it's still fairly flexible. We can still move it around because there's still quite a bit of water under the carrier film, and that allows you to just line it up where you want. At this stage, if you want to use a cocktail stick, you can use that as well. And once you're happy with the decal into place, like so, just go ahead and absorb all of the moisture underneath the carrier film by gently pressing it outwards from the centre. Don't apply too much pressure or you will potentially remove some of the ink from the surface on the carrier film there. And with all of that done and your decals applied to your model, and once you're happy with it, leave it to dry properly for a couple of hours, potentially even overnight if you want. Don't put it over a source of heat because you might create a few ripples. And once you're happy with it, what I prefer to do is seal the transfers completely with a spray paint, gloss for instance, masking off windows just to make sure that there's no way that they can peel away later on. Or if you're not really handling the model, there shouldn't really be a problem. So there you are, one model, transfers in place, ready to go on your layout.
As the editor of Narrow Gauge World magazine, which is British Railway Modelling sister title, The locomotives in this shed are very familiar to me and regularly appear in our pages, and it's very unusual to see them all at rest in the middle of the off-season here, and the sheer variety that's simply parked in this shed shows just what an interesting place the Ffestiniog Railway is. If we start with this locomotive here, which is one of the very first engines built for the Ffestiniog Railway, right back in 1863, the Prince was one of the first engines of its type on any narrow gauge railway line. Moving across, we have another very old locomotive from the late 19th century, the Blanche and her sister Linda, who originally worked at the Penryn Quarries, which is just over the hill from the Ffestiniog Railway, and came here in the earliest days of preservation when the Ffestiniog preservationists were desperate for additional motive power. They have since been greatly modified whilst here and have proved absolute stalwarts of the Ffestiniog line. Again, totally different. We have this, which is a very, very typical example of the Quarry Hunslet locomotive, used in innumerable quarries throughout North Wales. Quarry Hunslets were built in their hundreds. This particular one worked at Penarossi Quarry further north and was bought by a group of Ffestiniog volunteers, and is here basically as an extra attraction. And of course the Quarry Hunslet, which is possibly one of the most recognisable narrow gauge locomotives of all, is shortly to be immortalised in 009 scale by Bachmann, which is a major example of how 009 as a modelling narrow gauge scale is growing at present. This, on the face of it, is another very old locomotive, Taliesin. The Ffestiniog Railway was very famous worldwide for its double and single fairley locomotives, which were articulated engines with a great deal of power for the narrow gauge. The double fairleys came first, followed by this, a single fairley, and Taliesin was one of two that worked on the Ffestiniog Railway. However, this Taliesin is not quite what it seems, because the original Taliesin was scrapped in the 1930s, and this is a complete replica built up by the Preservation Railway much more near the millennium, and it has proved again a stalwart locomotive for the railway. And the way the single fairley works is by the use of a power bogie. There is a power bogie under here that works with a flexible steam pipe, which allows it to have great power whilst continuing to go round very sharp curves. And we can have a look at a power bogie because one is actually out of a locomotive right now. This is a typical example of a fairly articulated power bogie. The beauty of the bogies on the Ffestiniog Railway is that they are to a degree interchangeable. This particular one has come out of the double fairley David Lloyd George, whereas it could just as easily go under Taliesin, the single fairley that we were looking at just now. As you can see, it's a completely self-contained unit which swings under the footplate using a flexible steam pipe, which allows the engine to traverse the very sharp curves that are typical of the Ffestiniog. So as I say, this one is been removed from the double fairley David Lloyd George, which is currently under winter maintenance, and we can see the locomotive out in the yard there. So here we see David Lloyd George, a typical example of a double fairley locomotive, and as you can see, fairly obviously, you can see where the power bogie that we just looked at in the workshop has come from, the other end here, and it can simply be slid out and worked upon as is needed. Now, David Lloyd George is an example of a locomotive type that goes back to the earliest days of the railway. The fairleys rose to prominence in the 1870s, but just like Taliesin, David Lloyd George is a much younger locomotive, built in 1992, not as a replica, but a complete new build, and the newest double fairley on the railway. However, it won't be the newest for much longer, because the railway is currently in the process of beginning the build work on an all-new double fairley that will reuse the name of a long scrapped locomotive, James Spooner, and we will see that come to fruition over the next 2 or 3 years.
We hope you enjoyed this month's Distinctively Welsh DVD. Next time, Phil Parker and Andy York discover the HMRS Museum and Library at the Midland Railway Centre. They also take a look at some of the excellent restoration works in the sheds.